Can you make the case for and against the Hunter Biden laptop story, for it being a big deal and against it being a big deal?
Sure. So the case for it being a big deal is basically twofold. One is that it is clearly relevant if the president's son is running around to foreign countries picking up bags of cash because his last name is Biden while his father is vice president of the United States. And it raises questions as to influence peddling for either the vice president or the former vice president using political connections. Did he make any money? Who was the big guy, right? All these open questions that obviously implicates, the questions to be asked. And then the secondary reason that the story is big is actually because of the reaction to the story. The banning of the story is in and of itself a major story. If there's any story that implicates a presidential candidate in the last month of an election, and there is a media blackout, including a social media blackout, that obviously raises some very serious questions about informational flow and dissemination in the United States.
So no matter how big of a deal the story is, it is a big deal that there's a censorship of any relevant story.
When there's a coordinated, collusive blackout, yeah, that's a serious and major problem. So those are the two reasons why it would be a big story. The two reasons, a reason why it would not be a big story, perhaps, is if it turns out, and we don't really know this yet, but let's say that Hunter Biden was basically off on his own, doing what he was doing, being a derelict or a drug addict or acting badly, and his dad had nothing to do with it, and Joe was telling the truth, and he really knew. But the problem is we never actually got those questions answered. So if it had turned out to be nothing of a story, the nice thing about stories that turn out to be nothing is that after they turn out to be nothing, they're nothing. The biggest problem with this story is that it wasn't allowed to take the normal life cycle of a story, which is original story breaks, follow-on questions are asked, follow-on questions are answered. Story is either now a big story or into nothing. When the life cycle of a story is cut off right at the very beginning, right when it's born, then that allows you to speculate in any direction you want. You can speculate. It means nothing. It's nonsense. It's Russian. It's a Russian laptop. It's disinformation. Or on the other hand, this means that Joe Biden was personally calling Hunter and telling him to pick up a sack of cash over in Beijing, and then he became president and he's influence peddling. So this is why it's important to allow these stories to go forward. So this is why actually the bigger story for the moment is not the laptop. It's the reaction to the laptop, because it cut off that life cycle of the story. And then, at some point, I would assume that there will be some follow-on questions that are actually answered. I mean, the House is pledging, if it goes Republican, to investigate all of this. Again, I wouldn't be supremely surprised if it turns out that there was no direct involvement of Joe in this sort of stuff, because it turns out, as I said before, that all of politics is Veep. Mm-hmm. And this is always the story with half the scandals that you see, is that everybody assumes that there's some sort of deep and abiding, clever plan that some politician is implementing it. And then you look at it and it turns out, no, it's just something dumb, right? This is sort of perfect example of this, President Trump with the classified documents in Mar-a-Lago. So people on the left, it's probably nuclear codes. Probably he's taking secret documents and selling them to the Russians or the Chinese. And the real most obvious explanation is Trump looked at the papers and he said, I like these papers. And then he just decided to keep them. Right. And then people came to him and said, Mr. President, you're not allowed to keep those papers. He said, who are those people? I don't care about what they have to say. I'm putting them in the other room in a box. Which is that it is highly likely that is what happened. And it's very disappointing to people, I think, when they realize it. The human brain, I mean, you know this better than I do, but the human brain is built to find patterns, right? It's what we like to do. We like to find plans and patterns because this is how we survived in the wild, is you found a plan, you found a pattern, you cracked the code of the universe. When it comes to politics, the conspiracy theories that we see so often, it's largely because we're seeing inexplicable events, unless you just assume everyone's a moron. If you assume that there's a lot of stupidity going on, everything becomes quickly explicable. If you assume that there must be some rationale behind it, you have to come up with increasingly convoluted conspiracy theories to explain just why people are acting the way that they're acting. And I find that, I won't say 100% of the time, but 94% of the time, the conspiracy theory turns out just to be people being dumb, and then other people reacting in dumb ways to the original people being dumb.
But it's also, to me, in that same way, very possible, very likely that the Hunter Biden getting money in Ukraine, I guess, for consulting and all that kind of stuff is a nothing burger. He's qualified. He's getting money as he should. There's a lot of influence peddling in general that's not corrupt.
I think the most obvious explanation there probably is that he was fake influence peddling, meaning he went to Ukraine and he's like, guess what? My dad's Joe. And they're like, well, you don't have any qualifications in oil and natural gas and you don't really have a great resume, but your dad is Joe. And then that was kind of the end of it. They gave him a bag of cash, hoping he would do something. He never did anything.
I think you're making it sound worse than it is. I think that in general, consulting is done in that way. Your name, it's not like you're.
I agree with you.
You're not. It's not like he is some rare case, and this is an illustration of corruption. If you can criticize consulting, which I would,
That's fair.
which they're basically not providing. You look at a resume and who's who. Like if you went to Harvard, I can criticize the same thing. If you have Harvard on your resume, you're more likely to be hired as a consultant. Maybe there's a network there of people that you know, and you hire them in that same way. If your last name is Biden, there's a lot of last names that sound pretty good at it, right?
No, for sure.
And
for
so,
sure.
and it's
And
not
Hunter
like
Biden admitted that much, by the way, right? In an open interview, he was like, "If your last name weren't Biden when you got that job," and he's like, "Probably not." And,
yeah,
and
but
you're
that's
right.
an honest.
I agree with you.
It's not like he's getting a ridiculous amount of money. He was getting like a pretty standard consulting kind of money, which also I would criticize because they get a ridiculous amount of money. But I sort of even to push back on the life cycle or to steel man the side that was concerned about the Hunter Biden laptop story. I don't know if there is a natural life cycle of a story because there's something about the virality of the internet that we can't predict, that a story can just take hold and the conspiracy around it builds, especially around politics, where the interpretation, some popular, sexy interpretation of a story that might not be connected to reality at all will become viral. And that, from Facebook's perspective, is probably what they're worried about, is a organized misinformation campaign that makes up a sexy story or sexy interpretation of the vague story that we have, and that has an influence on the populace.
I mean, I think that's true, but I think the question becomes, who's the great adjudicator there, right? Who adjudicates when the story ought to be allowed to go through even a bad life cycle or allowed to go viral, as opposed to not? Now, it's one thing if you want to say, okay, we can spot the Russian accounts that are actually promoting this stuff. They belong to the Russian government. Got to shut that down. I think everybody agrees. This is actually one of the slides that's happened linguistically that I really object to, is the slide between disinformation and misinformation. You notice there was this evolution. In 2017, there was a lot of talk about disinformation. It was Russian disinformation. The Russians were putting out deliberately false information in order to skew election results, was the accusation. And then people started using disinformation or misinformation. And misinformation is either mistaken information or information that is quote unquote out of context. That becomes very subjective very quickly as to what out of context means. And it doesn't necessarily have to be from a foreign source. It can be from a domestic source, right? It could be somebody misinterpreting something here. It could be somebody interpreting something correctly, but PolitiFact thinks that it's out of context. And that sort of stuff gets very murky very quickly. And so I'm deeply uncomfortable with the idea that Facebook, I mean, Zuckerberg was on with Rogan and talking about how, the FBI had basically said, look out for Russian interference in the election. And then all of these people were out there saying that the laptop was Russian disinformation. So he basically shut it down. That sort of stuff is frightening, especially because it wasn't Russian disinformation. I mean, the laptop was real. And so the fact that you have people who seem to, let's put it this way, it seems as though, maybe this is wrong, it seems as though when a story gets killed preemptively like this, it is almost universally a story that negatively affects one side of the political aisle. I can't remember the last time there was a story on the right that was disinformation or misinformation, where social media stepped in and they went, we cannot have this. This cannot be distributed. We're going to all collude that this information is not distributed. Maybe in response to the story being proved false, it gets taken down. But what made the Hunter Biden thing so amazing is that it wasn't really even a response to anything. It was like the story got posted. There were no actual doubts expressed as to the verified falsity of the story. It was just supposition that it had to be false, and everybody jumped in. So I think that confirmed a lot of the conspiracy theories people had about social media and how it works.
Yeah, so if the reason you want to slow down the viral spread of a thing is at all grounded in partisanship, that's a problem. Like, you should be very honest with yourself and ask yourself that question. Is it because I'm on the left or on the right that I want to slow this down? Versus, is it hate? Bipartisan hate speech. Right. So but it's really tricky. But I like you, I'm very uncomfortable in general with any kind of slowing down, with any kind of censorship. But if there's something like a conspiracy theory that spreads hate, that becomes viral, I still lean to let that conspiracy theory spread, because the alternative is dangerous, more dangerous.
It's sort of like the ring of power, right? Like, everybody wants the ring because with the ring you can stop the bad guys from going forward. But it turns out that the ring gives you enormous power, and that power can be used in the wrong ways too.